Check, check. Hi. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. If I could please have your attention. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us at the Congressman's Town Hall. This morning, I'll do a brief run of show. My name is Ryan. I'm one of the Congressman's district representatives. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. So I'd just like to say before we start, as there is a long line, we are streaming this on Facebook Live right now, so if you were in that line and you were unable to come into the building, you could still view it via Facebook on the Congressman's Facebook page, as well as it is being played through CCTV on channel 27 for Comcast and 99 for UVerse. That said, very briefly, the way the run of show will be for this morning is that the Congressman will do a brief PowerPoint presentation where we will then hear from our panelists as well as the Congressman for a Q&A session. The question cards, if you have them and they are filled out, please raise them in the air and staff members will come around to grab them for you. If you have not filled out your entire address and email address on that question card, if we do not get to it today, just due to the sheer volume of people that are here, we won't be able to respond to it, as we do respond to all questions that we receive. We do have some electeds and dignitaries in the room today. Firstly, we have Teresa Geringer, the Lafayette School Board President. We have Mayor Pete Longmire, the Mayor of Pittsburgh. Kevin Wilk with the Walnut Creek City Council. And joining the panelists after the PowerPoint presentation, we have some speakers. Griffin Dix with the Oakland Alameda County. He's the chapter co-president of the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence, here in the front row. And we have Dr. Rose Kagawa, Robertson Fellow in Violence Prevention Research with the University of California, Davis, here in the front row as well. And at this time, I'd like to ask Rachel Zinn, the Lafayette School District Superintendent, to please come up.
Test, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me in the back? Yes? I am Rachel Zinn, and I'm the very proud superintendent of the Lafayette School District, and it's my absolute honor to be able to introduce Congressman DeSaulnier this morning. I also want to thank all of you for being here. I know that you have a million things going on a Saturday morning, so the fact that you came to join us and talk about this important topic, I know means a lot to the congressman and actually to me as a superintendent. So thank you so much. Congressman Mark DeSaulnier represents California's 11th congressional district in the San Francisco East Bay, including a majority of Contra Costa County. In January 2015, he was sworn in as a member of the 114th Congress, and he was appointed to serve on the Committee on Education and the Workforce and the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Mark is a former small business owner who has been in public service for the last 25 years. During that time, DeSaulnier passed 61 bills into California law as both a California state senator and an assembly member. Included in that amazing portfolio is a first-in-the-nation menu labeling bill to address growing obesity. Other landmark legislation he co-authored created a new regional planning approach to solve environmental challenges that no single city can fix on its own. In the California State Senate, DeSaulnier was chair of the Transportation and Housing Committee, where he spearheaded an investigation on issues plaguing the Bay Bridge. In the State Assembly, he received the distinction of being the first freshman in history to chair the Assembly Transportation Committee. He has experience as a Concord City Council member, mayor, and as a member of the County Board of Supervisors. On the Board of Supervisors, Mark sponsored the Industrial Safety Ordinance and the Refinery Flare Rule for local refineries and chemical facilities. He's also supported women's health programs and clinics, the Children and Families Budget, Children's Report Card, and performance-based budgeting. Further, if that isn't enough, Mark served as a representative on the California Air and Resources Board and as a board member for the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. Mark was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, where he attended Holy Cross. He worked for the Boston Juvenile Court as a warehouse worker and as a hotel services employee. Mark has been a small business owner most of his career. Congressman DeSaulnier lives in Concord, where he raised his 2 sons. I just want to also add that he has been a tremendous supporter of education, and I have been personally so impressed with his ability to listen and to always come out and speak and grapple with some very tough issues. I would just add, too, that if you have any comments, questions about the Lafayette School District and what we're doing with these issues, I would just encourage you to always call me or feel free to email me. It is with absolute great pride that I introduce to you this morning Congressman Mark DeSaulnier. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yes. I get a yes and no's. All right, I'll try to speak up as much as I can, and hopefully this mic will do it. If not, I'll go to the handheld mic. I will, as soon as I don't want to get in front of the PowerPoint, but we will all go up in just a moment. So first of all, thank you all for coming. We apologize that we didn't have a bigger venue. Normally this is sufficient. I do want to really thank Rochelle. She's been terrific to work with, and the school district. I really want to thank the Lafayette School District. They were always terrific to work with. I also want to thank the City of Lafayette and the Police Department. This came together very quickly, so we really appreciate all of you coming, but specifically our hosts. And then I do want to introduce our fabulous district director. We have 7 full-time employees to represent about 800,000 people, from Richmond and the west end of Contra Costa to Antioch and down to the San Ramon-Danville border. So it's a large district, 7 staff people. Chanel Scales-Preston is our district director, standing right over here. And Ryan, who did the introduction and will facilitate. We've got some technical stuff going on here. Okay.
Test.
That's okay. Technology, how's that? We're in the Bay Area. This always happens, technology. So I introduced Chanel. I did want to mention Ryan, who just helped with that, and it will facilitate the questions. Does all our Veterans Affairs issues. He's a former Marine. So I want to acknowledge both of them and all of my staff. They do a great job. So I'm going to run through a PowerPoint. If it goes quickly, I apologize, but we do want to get to questions, so there's so many people here. All of the questions we will answer. If we don't answer them today, we will respond to you, particularly if you left an email address, makes it efficient for us. And this won't be the last town hall we do on this issue. We were planning on doing some town halls on gun violence. And this one we sped up because of the tragedy in Florida and the concern that people have. So we appreciate you being here. Next week we will do our 60th town hall and mobile district office hour. In the 3 years I've been in Congress, I've always done a lot of town halls. Maybe it's because I grew up by Concord, Massachusetts. It's just, I think it's the essence of democracy. And we do them in different ways, but mostly we like to do these live and in person. And we do them as general ones. The next one in Concord at Ignacio Valley High School will be just a general one. This one is a specific topic, so we do it both ways. So I'm going to run through this quickly. And again, if you want to go along with this, it's on our website. You can quickly Google DeSaulnier, and there aren't many people named DeSaulnier, so you'll go to my website pretty quickly. So one of the things that's been so frustrating about this issue, having been involved with it since I was in local government, very active when I was in the legislature, is that in a healthy democracy, when we have issues like this, we have a discussion. And we respect people who have different views and different opinions, and we work through it. And we have legislation, we have hearings in public, and we have a vote. This is one of the issues in my time that we can't get to that point. And I think it's because I'm fairly convinced that people who profit from the sale of guns in the United States start off by screaming. They get their supporters to scream. So that's why it's not working, in my opinion. Maybe this is the opportunity. Maybe these young people, I hope to God, have got this country to the point where we can all take a deep breath, we can feel strongly about our opinions, but we insist on a healthy democracy where people exchange ideas, and at the end of the day, there's a vote by the United States House of Representatives, and you can hold us accountable. In the 3 years, thanks. In the 3 years I've been in Congress, there have been over 300 gun violence bills introduced by Democrats and some Republicans, predominantly by Democrats. Not one of them have had a vote. Not one of them have had a hearing. There's no accountability. It's time for Speaker Ryan, and there's pushback now from Peter King, a wonderful Republican, moderate, from New York and others to say it's time for us to start to discuss these things the way a democracy should work. Okay, with that, just quickly, we like to frame as much as we can. People pick their own numbers, but this is what our staff has put together just in a short period of time. Let me start with the framing on this. So that's the Second Amendment on the top. The second quote is from a very controversial decision. It was a 5-4 vote by the justice who wrote the majority opinion, the Heller decision, which said that the District of Columbia had a rule that if you had a gun in your residence, it either had to be locked or disassembled. This threw out 70 years of court opinions and said that that was unconstitutional. But even in that controversial decision, Justice Scalia, one of the most conservative justices in the history of the country, said that there could be reasonable restrictions. So when people say we're going to take all our guns away, the only way that that could happen is a constitutional amendment that eliminated the Second Amendment. So when people start screaming about that, I don't want to take your guns away. Most people who have guns are rational, reasonable, responsible. We can respect them. But we can have a discussion about what are reasonable restrictions. Next. So I'm going to run through these. These are just some numbers. If you have questions and you look at these or you don't agree with them, you can feel free to email or call us and we'll give you the source. But this is a real problem in this country. The second bullet is particularly telling. We have 20 times the higher, 20 times, not 20%, firearm homicides in this country than 22 other developed countries in the world that are similar to us that have twice the population of the United States. So we are an outlier when it comes to these issues. Next. This is, you can see the assault weapons ban that was in place, Senator Feinstein's bill. I'm a co-author of her bill now. And you can see that when we did that after 101 California, if you're old enough to remember that mass shooting, generally they spiked before and they went back up after that. So important in context. Next. This is a wonderful display. All right. That's citizen involvement. A lot of people tell me not to be so loud. So gun violence laws are ranked by the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. California has the 9th lowest rate of gun violence in the country because along with Connecticut, New York, and other states, we have really aggressive gun laws in gun violence prevention in California. Next. And this is just an indication again for the 10 states that have the most aggressive gun violence prevention laws. 7 of them also have the best outcomes, the fewest gun violence incidents. Next. This just is confusing, I know. Democracy can be confusing. Florida is one of the states on the far end of not having a lot of gun violence restrictions, but you can see what we have in California and what is on the federal level. One of the things that's important for this is things happen in California as well, but having a national restriction on assault weapons, for instance, is more effective because there are fewer in the country that can go across state lines. California is a big state, but cities like Chicago and Baltimore that have similar laws, they have high gun violence for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the illegal guns that are brought into the jurisdiction because there are states around there that have less restrictions, they're higher. So next. This is just a startling international comparison, so you can't see all of those, but at the top is Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, Ireland. I could make a crack about the quality of those countries. Canada, Luxembourg, that was a joke. Belgium, Switzerland, and the United States at the bottom. So just a real description of a very accurate and startling visual of what the comparisons are. This is hard for you to see, but it's a really good graph about guns per 100 people on the bottom and mass shooters per 100 million people. The dots are in the graph. You can see where the United States is, and you can see where France, Canada, Iraq, Afghanistan are. So something is amiss in the United States of America. This is important to me personally. Why I've been so active in gun violence is it'll be 30 years next year. My father committed suicide with a gun in Florida. We don't know how he got the gun because 30 years ago it was, but a lot of people will say when it comes to suicide, so 2/3 of the deaths by guns in the United States are by suicides, not by homicides. So you don't read about these, but for people like me who have experienced this in a family, it's personal and it's tragic. So, and you can see by firearm the accuracy. So people will say when we bring up suicide, I've heard it hundreds of times, oh, well, he would have killed himself some other way, not statistically. In almost 97% of the times that somebody tries to commit suicide with a gun, it works, unfortunately. They die. In the second and third most used, by poison, 7.4%. So most of the people survive suicide when they try it other ways. And then by cutting themselves or stabbing themselves, just 5%. Next. Mental health and guns. So presidents talked about this. There is a legitimate issue to talk about, but I want you to look at the third bullet in particular, that only 4% of American gun deaths could be attributed directly to mental health issues. That was an extensive study by Duke and Johns Hopkins and Oxford, UCLA. So mental health is an issue. In this county, we do a really good job. The county mental health department, Rochelle and I were just talking about this, and the sheriff's department for years have been doing best practices around risk assessment. So I would argue what happened in Florida would not, and the mistakes that happened with the FBI and the local police department would not have happened here because of the collaboration for years between the county mental health department, the sheriff's department, and police departments, and school districts. So I'm actually going to talk to a colleague who's very conservative. He actually sells guns in Oklahoma. I'm going to talk to him about maybe we could do something around this to incentivize the good practices that we do here in Contra Costa. Los Angeles is a leader in this as well. Next. We can go to the next one. So this is congressional action. A lot of people would say that's an oxymoron right now. This is the current makeup of the House, so we know that you read about how divisive it is. It is divisive on these big issues. On a lot of just day-to-day issues, we work well with our colleagues. I've got 7 pieces of legislation in the law. All of those required Republican support. I've got about 15 pieces of legislation out of the House of Representatives that required Republican co-authors and support. So we do work together. It's just on these big issues where there's a lot of money involved from the outside, it gets very intransigent. Next. This is hard to see again as well, but what it talks about is votes on the House, and you can see these dates. This is all long time ago, except for reciprocity, which we just did another bill in 2017, which is actually making it less restrictive. So the 2 bills that have been heard in the House in the time I've been there are silencers. So the Republican majority and the manufacturers want to make it legal nationally and preempt state laws that you could have silencers. Particularly bad for law enforcement in this county. Richmond in particular has been very effective at using technology that identifies when a gun goes off. They've actually saved people's lives who were lying and dying, and nobody reported it. But because of the technology, the police department was able to dispatch somebody, and they found people who had been shot. The issue of reciprocity is particularly galling to me because what it would say, would allow anybody who has is allowed to have a concealed weapon take that state's laws and bring it into California. So California, we're restrictive when it comes to concealed permit. Yeah, that deserves boo. It's awful. And this is from people who argue about states' rights. Next. So again, if you want to look at this on the website or print it out, this is all, I think, really good material. It's just this is polling on how different Republicans view gun control and Democrats. And just what it says is there are things that there is consensus on. So there's consensus on Senator Feinstein's bill. We would prohibit assault weapons to be sold in the United States. The second one is one of the issues we went to the floor and had a sit-in for, is to allow a bill that if you're on the do not fly list, that you're considered dangerous to the public, you wouldn't be able to buy a gun either. And the last one, which is 77% approval, the third one I should say, and 90% approval, 77% polling approval by Republicans, 90% by Democrats, is to eliminate the loopholes on background checks. Next. So this is just a brief. I mentioned the 250 bills. There's 300 bills now, considering that when you consider this year as well. I said that none of them have received a hearing, a vote on the floor. I've got 2 bills that I've submitted. I was very active with the Brady campaign in California in the legislature. I introduced the first smart gun legislation. There's a lot of money and a lot of technology going into having guns personally identify their users, either by biometrics or by an individual PIN. You do it for your phone, as President Obama said. Why can't you do it for guns? We're trying to get more money into that so that we can start making guns safer that way. So only the authorized user, the licensee, or up to 13 individuals that they would choose, the gun would work for. It would really eliminate stolen guns because they would become largely worthless. Okay, next. I am proud owner of a lifetime F score. Thanks. I'm told that I may have a F minus, so I'm aspiring to that. Which is, when you read the history of the National Rifle Association, it's too bad, because when it started, it was about educating people about gun use. They still do good work in that field, but unfortunately, over the course of the history of it, it has become a marketing tool, in my view, and by a lot of people, for American gun manufacturers. And the American gun industry, if you want to read about its history, a terrific book is called Gunning of America. They're brilliant at marketing and putting the marketing in our culture. Unfortunately, they don't know when to stop and to work with us. So money is important. Campaign finance, I just tell you that one of the reasons we have such dysfunction in our federal government right now is something called independent expenditures. In the last cycle, $7 billion, the most in history because of Supreme Court 5-4 decisions in 2010. Citizens United, another one called Speech Now, decided that we could have no control as citizens or your representatives over independent expenditures. So $7 billion in the last cycle in independent expenditures, that's more than twice that the Republican and Democratic National Committees spent. So this lack of accountability has paralyzed the functioning of the House of Representatives. And this is an example of it. So 2010 was when that court decision happened. You can now see 2016, what's happening with that. Okay, this is just, we like to do performance standards. This is on our website and our social media. Chanel and the six people who work with Chanel and myself in the district, they do a remarkable job. We have 7 people in DC, so 14 people. Next slide. Some people doubt that I've actually done. Some people who don't care for me, I guess, think this is fake news, so we decided to put all the dates in the... I am not an actor. And this is just something that came out yesterday that I'm tremendously proud of. We are one of 6 finalists out of 435 members of the House of Representatives, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, and we are finalists for this award for excellence in constituent relations, and I'm particularly proud of it. Okay, so those are our contact numbers, and I'll go up on the stage and ask our guests, our panelists, to come with me. All great ballet. And again, I want to thank Rachel. All right, so we're going to start with Griffin, and I'll just ask him to give any background he wants in terms of a biography.
I'm Griffin Dix, co-chair of the Oakland Alameda County chapter of the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. I got involved with gun violence prevention from 1994 when my 15-year-old son was killed in an unintentional shooting when he was visiting the home of a friend in Berkeley, and the boy thought he had unloaded his father's semi-automatic handgun and took the gun that his father kept for protection, loaded and unlocked, next to his bed, and the boy got it and took it back to the boy's bedroom where my son was, walked in the door and pulled the trigger thinking it would just go click. And the bullet hidden in the chamber killed my son. And from that devastation and grief, I and my wife began to learn about all the loopholes in the gun laws, and we learned more and more and met more and more victims of gun violence and realized a lot needs to be done to prevent gun violence. I have 8 things I want to say, and I'm going to go over them very quickly, and especially since many of them have been mentioned, and we'll have more to say in the quick Q&A period. The first thing I want to say is that California's firearm laws are saving lots and lots of lives. They work. The peak rate of gun death, both in California and in the rest of the country, occurred in 1993. And since then, as California's laws have gone into effect, California's rate of gun death has declined 3.5 times more than the decline in the rest of the country. So the laws, our laws are saving lots of lives, and Representative DeSaulnier is largely or very important in that reductions, as you saw. He authored and helped sponsor many important bills, so I want to thank him. Second, however, California's laws are threatened by weak federal laws. Just to give you one example, police recover crime guns and trace them, and more crime guns recovered in California, turns out, have come from out of state, more and more of them. So interstate gun trafficking into California is a problem. Now, there are 3 things I want to mention that I think we need to do at the federal level. We need, of course, to require background checks for all gun sales, including private party sales. And it seems to me that anyone opposing such a law is helping criminals, terrorists, and other dangerous prohibited persons helping them easily obtain guns, including assault weapons. So we've talked about that briefly, and no more needs to be said about that. Next, we need a federal assault weapons ban. The you know, he showed a graph showing that the numbers of mass shootings declined during the federal assault weapons ban between 1994 and 2004. I think I see Steve Spazzato out there in the audience, who helped get that law passed. But it also reduced the availability of large capacity magazines, which make shooting so lethal. It reduced the use of assault weapons in crime. Third, we also need a federal extreme risk protective order. Now, what is that? It's a law that allows law enforcement or family members who know that someone is a risk to himself or others to give the evidence to a judge who can evaluate the evidence and say that this person should have a gun removed from his possession and not be able to buy a gun. And you read about the evidence in the Florida shooting and you realize how there are cases in which this can be very, very useful. There are 2 things that concern me, and one was just mentioned, the concealed carry reciprocity at the federal level, the idea of that people who get a permit in states that are extremely lax in allowing practically anyone to get a concealed carry permit might be able to come into California and carry firearms here. That's extremely dangerous. We cannot allow that to happen. The next thing is that concerns me is currently federal law does not allow people, for example, Californians cannot go to Nevada or Arizona and buy firearms from licensed dealers there. People cannot go to another state and buy in the other firearm from a licensed dealer in those other states. And that's a good law because California has safety standards for handguns. We have an assault weapons ban and so forth. Now, the gun manufacturers know that California is a big firearms market, and they would like to be able to sell more and more guns to Californians. So they would like to find ways to eliminate that law, and like slipping it in negotiations, and allow Californians to be able to go to other states and buy firearms from licensed dealers. We don't want to let that happen in any negotiations on any future firearms legislation. So just the final thing I will leave you with is Californians would be a lot safer if more people who favor responsible, sensible gun laws were elected to Congress. Thank you.
Thanks, Griffin. And before I give the mic to Rose, because this is an introduction to Rose's comments. So in the Congress, the Center for Disease Control, very well-respected government agency based in Georgia, does wonderful research, obesity, cancers, secondhand smoke. They used to do investigations into gun violence. The Congress some years ago, and it was the majority party at that time, the Republicans as today, took the money away for any funding at CDC. Last session, while I was there, they not only did that, they passed a law that said it prohibited from the CDC to doing any research. So what California did, and it was my former seatmate in the state Senate, they actually put in the budget more money for a world-class center that Rose is part of at the University of California at Davis. So California once again said, if you're not going to do it at the federal level, we'll do it in California.
Great. Thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be a part of this panel and part of this event. So I'm an epidemiologist and a researcher from the Violence Prevention Research Program and the center that the Congressman was just mentioning. It's called the University of California Firearm Violence Research Center, and both of these things are at UC Davis. So we focus on understanding the causes, consequences, and prevention of firearm violence, and our work is very applied. Our goal is to produce research that supports good policy making and improves public safety. And our research encompasses all forms of firearm violence. So that includes mass shootings, self-directed violence like suicide, interpersonal violence, and unintentional shootings. We lose more than 90 civilians to firearm violence every day in the United States. And the shooters and the victims tend to look different depending on what the form of violence is. And so I want to emphasize the importance of considering all forms of firearm violence when we do this work and when we have these conversations, because the causes and prevention efforts may look different depending on whether we are preventing mass shootings, suicides, unintentional shootings, or homicides. Just to mention a couple projects that we're working on, Mr. Dix mentioned the gun violence restraining order here in California that allows people to petition a court to have guns removed from somebody who poses an immediate threat to themselves or others. And we are, this was implemented it was passed in 2016, and we are working on an evaluation of this bill in order to understand what the effects are. And so this is the kind of information that can help us inform policy. We're also working on a study to understand if there are other prohibiting markers to prevent, to find high-risk people in order to include them in the prohibiting categories for purchasing firearms. Things like alcohol abuse. And then the new center that just started in July, we are about to field a survey in California, the first of its kind in 40 years, that would help us understand the basic epidemiology of firearm violence and firearm ownership and perceptions around firearm violence and safety in California. And it's this kind of information that can help us build our knowledge base. And I want to say that as I attempt to answer questions today, you might find me using the refrain, there isn't very good evidence on fill in the blank. Effective policy is built on objective science, and the state of California is funding the center's research, but it's getting harder and harder to get federal funding for this kind of work. The focus and ability is there to produce this knowledge base, and that can direct our policy choices, and we just need to support it. So thank you again.
Questions?
Okay, so very briefly, once again, we do have staff. If you have a question card and it is filled out, you could raise it in the air, and one of our staff members will try and get to it as quickly as possible. We do have a packed house, so please bear with us as we try and get through. Joining us with us as well now, we have Joan Carpenter, Senior Field Representative for County Supervisor John Joya in the front row here. So we will go to our first question. The first question would like to be read by the constituent, and I will walk to you. Alexandra Colas, if you could raise your hand. Oh, thank you.
Oh, I have to stand here now? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Before I ask my question, I think I speak on behalf of everybody in this room that the ultimate goal is ultimately for an assault rifle ban, a federal assault rifle ban. And what it's pretty clear, though, that right now in Washington, that's not going to happen with a Republican-controlled House, Senate, and executive. But my concern right now is while we wait for that ban to happen, and we have to believe that it is going to happen someday, what do we do now? What do we do if we knew right now that there was a credible threat to one of our schools? Would you say something? Do you go to your teachers, your counselors? Yes, we say, but what if it's your kid? What if it's your sister's? What if it's your best friend's kid? Maybe it wouldn't be, maybe the answer isn't exactly what you think it would be. An absolute yes, I would go. It seems, though, that the only defense we really have right now against gun violence in our schools is each other in our community. And the saying that as the saying goes, if you see something, then say something. I shook my head as I wrote this because speaking out didn't stop the Florida shooter. He was on everyone's radar. I'm not blaming anyone, especially the educators. I don't think stopping a school shooter was ever in their job description. Okay, the question, but what I was trying to say, though, and I went over this with Ryan earlier in the week, is in our community, which is so similar to Newtown, to Parkland, to Columbine, suburban, affluent, safe, great schools, beautiful surroundings, beautiful kids. 2 years ago, almost to the day, 2 years ago, it doesn't make any sense though. 2 years ago, almost to the day, I discovered my 16-year-old daughter, who was a junior at Campo, went through an extremely traumatic experience a few weeks before, one that takes years, if almost ever, to recover. She wasn't a threat to others, wasn't going to go pick up my gun, but I really grappled with the thought of, do I go to her counselors? Do I go to her teachers? Right now, she needs some help. Right now, our family needs some help. And I thought, oh God, I felt kind of ashamed and embarrassed. But I did it. And so I guess what I want to say is that, you know, even though me going to her teachers and feeling, and her counselors, Jake Donahoe at Camp Lindo, she's awesome. I didn't experience any sort of shame, any sort of, yeah, right. So I encourage you to all speak out if you see something.
Folks, if just a second, if you could wrap up, though.
I'm sorry.
We do, since we do so many of these and we've got so many questions,
so my question
we
to
will
you-
ask everybody to be concise, and we'll try to be concise as well.
So my question to you is, do you fully support a ban, a federal ban on assault rifles?
Yes, yes. As I said, I'm a co-author of Senator Feinstein's bill that would reestablish it. Okay, next one. So again, folks, we've got a lot of people here, a lot of questions. I know it's emotional, but if we can answer more questions and have more dialogue, if you ask a question and you're concise. I appreciate what happened just now, but we'll get better at it.
The next question is from Susan. My youngest just graduated from Acalanes High School, and I've endured 3 lockdowns at Acalanes for my children. How can we get better mental health services at Acalanes to help these kids before they attack our school children?
Well, California has, since we came out of our budget crisis when I was there, we put more money into schools. We try to put more money into schools. It's a priority in California. A key part of that is behavioral health and counselors. We're trying to do more clinics in high schools and middle schools. So all of those things have really good turnout. I had a bill passed with Glenn Thompson, a Republican colleague who's a good friend from Pennsylvania, that would increase $150 million in grants for just these kind of services from the federal government. Now would you like to say something?
Sure, thank you. I just want to touch on the topic, because you actually had the statistic up on your slide that 4% of community violence is caused by people with a mental illness. And there's a lot of conflation between dangerousness and mental illness. It's just important to reinforce that a lot of people who are the vast majority of people who with a mental illness are not violent and will never be violent. But I think the question, it's in some ways it's semantics, so the question is probably about the broader characteristics that are indicators of dangerousness.
So we need to do more. We need to spend more money. We know evidence-based research is not just on gun violence or violence. We know if we provide professional services to the population in general when it comes to substance abuse and mental health, that we have better outcomes. So the more money we spend, the more money we appropriate at the federal and state level and support these programs, the better outcomes you'll have. And I do want to thank all the young people who have joined us. Thank you.
Our next question is from Whitney. What reasons, if any, are there for a civilian to purchase and possess an assault rifle style weapon? Why is it so difficult to get this type of weapon banned?
I don't know. My own belief from seeing what happens and talking to my colleagues is the influence of money. And it's the marketing of the American gun industry. You know, it's interesting when you look at German manufacturers, Glock and others, when they're in Germany, they don't have this kind of mentality, and they have better legislation and better cultural and better health outcomes. So, but here it's just selling, and every time there's one of these incidents, they sell more product. You know, we had this problem with the tobacco industry in this country, and we had emotional discussions, and this county led the country in banning secondhand smoke. You don't even think about it anymore, but that was emotional. I was in the middle of it. But the worst part was, these were publicly traded companies with supposedly responsible executives who came to Congress and lied under oath and said their product wasn't addictive. And I bring this up because we've been through this before. It's discouraging when you see people who rationalize making money off of death. And that's the problem we have in this country from my perspective.
The gun industry utilizes fear constantly in its marketing and ramps up the fear of people and says, you need to buy a gun for self-defense. It turns out that if you bring a gun into your home, the chances of a homicide in your home increase by about 3 times, and the chances of a suicide in your home increase by something like 5 times. So that's not a good means of protection in the first place. But an assault weapon is a military-style weapon, even if it's semi-automatic, which is what these are. It's made for killing field, for shooting as many people as possible, even if it's in semi-automatic mode, meaning you have to pull the trigger, and each time you pull the trigger, only one bullet comes out. And with a bump stock device, it turns it into pretty much fully automatic mode, meaning it's firing, you know, at an enormously rapid rate, and it's even more lethal. And even with handguns, they're military-style handguns made from highly trained military people. The gun that killed my son was a handgun designed for highly trained military people. It did not have a prominent chamber-loaded indicator, something that sticks up in front of you that tells you there's still a bullet in the chamber. Even when you remove the magazine that has bullets in it, you know, untrained people often don't know that there's can still be a bullet in the chamber. Well, you're supposed to know. Trained people should know, but many people do not know that you can still pull the trigger even when there's no magazine in it, or an empty magazine in the semi-automatic handgun. The bullet still in the chamber can fire and kill someone. But so we passed a law in California requiring new models of semi-automatic handguns sold in the state to have a prominent chamber-loaded indicators, and the rate of unintentional firearm deaths in California dropped to about 1/3 of the rate in the rest of the country. And then, because California is such a large firearms market, the gun industry started manufacturing guns with those types of prominent loaded chamber indicators and selling them in the rest of the country. And the rate of unintentional gun deaths declined more rapidly in the rest of the country as well. So we made gun owners safer. Gun control made gun owners safer. Good. You know, we want to reduce gun deaths and injuries, and you know, California's gun laws help to do that.
I do want to mention one on the assault weapons. There's a wonderful column today in the New York Times by one of my colleagues, Brian Mast, a combat veteran, Republican, and he talks about, he lost both of his legs in Iraq, I believe, and he talks about how we should have a national assault weapons ban, and how he carried one. He knows how to use it. He's been I think he had 3 tours of combat, so if you get a chance, read that column. So there's movement.
Very quickly, once again, if you have a question card that you want a staff member to come, please raise it in the air, and one of us will come around and grab it for you as quickly as possible. Our next question is from Mr. Bob Hansen. He'd like to read his own question. Would you like to still read your question, sir?
I know Bob's going to be concise.
I'm not going to give a speech. Good. Don't worry. Mark, I'm just wondering whether there would be a possibility of a resolution in Congress to the effect that the Second Amendment applies to well-organized militias and musket rifles, which is what they had at the time it was written. Is there a possibility of a resolution that would influence the Supreme Court on this?
I would doubt it, given the current makeup, but happy to talk to you about it. Sounds like something I would introduce.
You know, in the Supreme Court's two important, fairly recent decisions about, redefining what the Second Amendment means. But before that, the Second Amendment meant was it a right of states to have well-regulated state militias, but the Heller decision and the McDonnell decision of the Supreme Court made it an individual right to have a handgun in the home for self-defense. However, those decisions have lists of ways that it is constitutional to regulate firearms. And you can regulate who can sell firearms, you can regulate where firearms can be taken, you can regulate who can buy firearms, you can regulate types of firearms that can be sold. There's lists in the decisions, and those lists should get more attention. We actually don't need to overturn the Second Amendment. There are lots of ways that regulations are constitutional under the current definition of the Second Amendment.
Next question is from Nathan Emley. He'd like to read his own question as well. Would you like to still do that, sir? Okay. If you wouldn't mind coming a bit forward for me. Excuse me.
While Ryan's going out to Nate, just a reminder, and there's lots of good writing on this, the Supreme Court is meant to adjudicate our constitutional questions. The founders did a wonderful job in that. But remember, the Constitution is a living document. I've taken multiple oaths to preserve and defend. But when you read the history of this country, remember the Dred Scott decision. I mean, there were decisions by the Supreme Court that allowed for slavery, decisions by the Supreme Court that said child labor laws passed by state governments were unconstitutional. So we go through these discussions and we change, and it depends on the appointees. It depends on who you elect, president in the U.S. Senate, to confirm federal judges. So the Constitution is a living document. It's brilliant. But within that document, we have these struggles and conversations. Maybe, as was just said, for the many people who do carry guns and hunt and do those things, we have passed laws that allow them to do those things. In California, we have lots of gun owners, and most of them are responsible. But we can do things that statistically saves lives. So within that context, sorry, I didn't mean to go on. Take your time.
Good morning. I wanted to ask, and you touched about this just now a little bit, but my question is, the first three words of the Second Amendment is well-regulated militia. I never hear anybody from the left say anything about Second Amendment should be embraced as a regulated thing. I mean, the word regulation is in the freaking amendment. Is there anything like compulsory licensing or, I don't know, having regular training with your local sheriff's department or something like that that could make the Second Amendment a little bit more holistic? Yes, you can have your guns, but also you have to have regulation. I know you just talked a lot about that, but he asked for me to read my question. I was excited.
So, did you finish? I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm done.
So as I mentioned when I did my presentation, even Justice Scalia mentioned regulation because it's in the Constitution. So in his decision, which I very much disagree with, but it was a 5-4 decision, so it's a law, he said reasonable regulations are permitted under the Constitution as it's currently written. So we can do all those things.
There are laws that are called, there are like states that have permit to purchase laws, which include, and I'm talking about this because I think it touches on some of the things that you've mentioned. Permit to purchase laws generally include a comprehensive background check, so you have to get a background check even for a private transfer, but there's also additional regulations, and a lot of times people you have to have a permit to purchase a firearm, and you have to renew it maybe annually, and you have to get training, and you have to approach law enforcement to get that permit. And these sorts of states, research shows that the risk of firearm homicide and suicide is lower in these states. And so I feel like that might be relevant here.
Our next question is from Shelley Somerset. I believe we should bring a class action suit against the NRA for aiding and abetting the various mass shootings. I know it has been tried before. Do you know of any way we can do this?
So this is one of the real outrages of Congress. Guns are the one consumer product that are immune from liability. Congress passed a law that did that. So part of that is you've got to change that law. There are lawsuits that are trying to get at liability of gun manufacturers when the product's used this way, just like we've seatbelts. We wouldn't have seatbelts if it wasn't for consumers saying that we want to have seatbelts and we want those regulated in the cars. You wouldn't, if the same laws applied to the gun manufacturers that applied to the car industry, you wouldn't have got seatbelts put in cars.
When my son was killed with a Beretta 92 semi-automatic pistol, the Brady campaign lawyers helped us bring a lawsuit against Beretta, arguing that the gun should have had a prominent chamber-loaded indicator in its design, and it should have had a built-in lock, and that the manual that came with the gun didn't come with enough warnings and enough information for the gun owner. And we went through 3 trials. There was jury misconduct. There was a hung jury. Finally, ultimately, we lost that lawsuit, and we had to pass the law in California requiring prominent chamber-loaded indicators in semi-automatic handguns. There were also at that time many cities bringing lawsuits against the gun industry, and also the victims of the horrible shooting at the Pettit and Martin law firm in San Francisco, the mass shooting with assault pistols, had brought a lawsuit, and the gun industry got Congress to eventually pass the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which prohibits civil lawsuits, most civil lawsuits against the gun industry, and that really should be overturned. It's an outrage.
Next question is from Dan Reynolds. He'd like to read his question. Would you still like to do that, sir? Okay.
Come on, Ryan, let's see how fast a Marine can move.
Thank you. Good morning, Congressman. I'm a 16-year teacher, a father of a 4th grader and a 1st grader, and the chair of the board of the Mount Diablo Peace and Justice Center, which is currently working on finalizing a resolution calling on lawmakers, especially in Congress, to pass a series of laws to prevent gun violence. Most of the proposals that I've been hearing about over the last 2 weeks are BS. They're lipstick on a pig. Arming teachers is a BS idea.
So I know there's a question here.
Will you go beyond the BS and commit to supporting a series of far-reaching and effective gun violence prevention laws, including eliminating concealed carry reciprocity, banning assault weapons and large-capacity magazines across the country, instituting government buyback and destruction of banned weapons and magazines, taxing ammunition at increased volumes, limiting the number of guns and bullets that a person can own, banning ownership for violent criminals, requiring universal background checks, and banning guns on schools?
That's easy. Yes, and I have a long history of either co-authoring many of the things you suggested in the legislature and in Congress, or voting for or against in the case of the reciprocity. So I have a record, and I'm more than committed to continue that record.
Next question is from Esther Garado. What positive signs do you see that Congress will actually pass comprehensive and effective gun legislation on gun control?
Well, I mentioned the article by Congressman Mast. I mentioned Peter King, Republican, well-respected from upstate New York, who is saying the same thing. So I think there is potential. But the only way we'll have this discussion nationally is if you, the citizens of the United States of America, are engaged in a passionate civil discourse with people who disagree with you, by the way, and then force us to have that discussion in public, in the open, have evidence-based research, drive the discussion, and then pass the law. And I think that because it's, yeah, excuse me, sir. The answer to the question is because it's my town hall. So that doesn't mean I don't respect your ability to ask questions. And in the future, if you have somebody who you think would be reasonable to be on a panel, excuse me. I told you that the way this works is I get elected to Congress. If you want to get rid of me, you go and you run against me or you vote against me. Okay. But part of the reason we don't is because we had a short time to put this together. So I'm happy to have somebody who's reasonable to be in the future. And if you can help me get that, I'll do that. All right, all right. I can't. Please, folks, please. So we can be civil to one another, but in order to manage the program, I can't get in a dialogue with 500 people individually. So let's go on to the next question. Be happy to talk to you after.
The next question is from Will Wilson. Why hasn't Congress held any gun control debates since Parkland?
Part of the reason is because, honestly, this week we were back in the districts. So when we go back, I would expect one of the things that will be really interesting is traditionally what happens is the members of the Florida delegation would get up and ask for a moment of silence. This is going to be a really interesting week when we go back. We all want to be respectful of that tradition. We want to be respectful of the people who lost their lives, but there are a lot of us that think the time for silence has ended, that we have to have a discussion. So but the literal reason is that we haven't had hearings is we are in the district. About 1 week out of the month, some months we don't have a week. We're supposed to be back in our districts doing what we're doing today.
Next question is from Barbara Dallas. First of all, thank you for organizing this special town hall so quickly. And my question is, does signing petitions make a difference?
Yes, it does. You got to stick at it. You just got to this is what government's supposed to be for. You've got to be engaged. You've got to stick at it. So a lot of people are upset about the last election. 63 million American registered voters didn't vote in the last election. That's not the way democracy is supposed to work. You have to engage. And for these young people, you can change the world if you engage. That doesn't mean you get everything you want.
Philip Shoemaker asks, in view of the intractable resistance to modifying the Second Amendment, what is the most meaningful legislation we can support that has any chance of passing?
I think redoing Senator Feinstein's assault weapon ban has a real possibility, given what I'm hearing from my colleagues in the majority party, some of them. And I think given what the president has said and other members of the majority have said, we could get rid of the loophole on background checks. So that's what I'm hoping, at a minimum.
Next question is from Aaron Bloom. They would like to read their own question. Would you still like to read your question? Okay. If you wouldn't mind coming a little bit closer for me.
Brian's getting his steps in today.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm a teacher, and Thank you. I teach here in the Lafayette School District, and I have a very simple question. What can be done, both by Congress and by us, to limit the influence of the NRA?
You have to be engaged, and you have to pay attention. These independent expenditures in particular are a huge problem because they're dropped at the last minute. Some of these people with billions of dollars can drop a check for $1 million, $5 million. Inside our campaigns, we raise too much money, and there's too much of a relationship between outside forces and us. So we have to change campaign finance laws, but we have to change that Supreme Court decision that gave on both Citizens United and Speech Now. But in the interim, you have to be vigilant. You can't believe everything that comes in your mailbox or you see at TV. It's ironic that we've got so much rich resources now available to us on the internet that actually is legitimate. Unfortunately, we've got a lot that's not. But if you engage yourself, you will be able to truth test much of this and make sure you vote and you participate. And then we'll have to get those things changed.
I just wanted to say, I think that everybody can agree on the idea of preventing injury and death at the end of a firearm. And understanding how to do that is not necessarily a partisan thing. And I think we just need to figure out, how to identify people who are high risk for violence and keep firearms out of their hands, but also maintain the rights of our citizens.
So, we need to understand the problems that the NRA is causing and the vast amount of, large amount of money that the NRA is spending to co-opt legislators. But on the other hand, in some ways, all the attention on the NRA is sort of a distraction. We need to focus on what we want and how to get it. We need to focus on bills and, as she says, what works and how to get it, and we need to focus on elections and how to win them in swing districts, and find the issues that resonate with voters and our talking points and nail them and get out there and do the legwork. And that, the NRA is irrelevant to that. So all this attention on the NRA is often a distraction.
The next question is from Linda Slider. Any chance to create a victim reparations fund by taxing gun and bullet sales so that innocent victims aren't left to pay the social costs of our out-of-control gun culture by themselves?
That's an interesting question. We'll look into it. I have a bill that I did in the legislature that I'm going to drop next week or the week after. And one of the reasons I want to do this is to get it somewhat removed from Congress, is to create a 5-member board on gun violence prevention that would have authority to implement evidence-based research without Congress. When I was on the Air Resources Board, it was a wonderful piece of legislation, the Clean Air Act. We've been able to reduce pollutants in the air, drive the economy in a positive way, because you have a board with expertise that does evidence-based research and works with the auto manufacturers and the trucking industry. So there are models to do this. So that's a bill that's sort of on the same lines that you have, but it goes back to the possibility of direct responsibility from the gun manufacturers in particular. And again, I want to say, in California with all these strict laws, we still have millions of people who have guns and are responsible with them. And all of our laws are consistent with the Second Amendment as adjudicated by the Supreme Court. So we can do these things that are evidence-based research and still be consistent with the Constitution as currently written. And we can avoid these things, and there should be liability, in my view, for the people who've lost their lives. And you've got 2 people up here on this panel who have lost members of their family because of gun violence.
Our next question is from Kathleen. Why can't we do what Australia did in 1996 and ban semi-automatic weapons coupled with a generous buyback program?
We should.
This is one of those times where I'm going to say there's just not a lot of evidence on that sort of thing, and so that's where we need to build the evidence base. And when we did our assault weapons ban, there were far fewer of weapons of that type in the United States, and they were used in a very small proportion of crime. So it was really difficult to do the kind of research to see what the impact is. California has had an assault weapons ban for 30 years, and we already it's illegal to sell or buy high-capacity magazines, and it's actually illegal to ban or to own a high-capacity magazine, except that is caught up in the courts. Oh, and I just want to respond to the comment earlier about who's on this panel, and I want to say that at the Research Center, our goal is not to do research that supports gun control. Our goal is to do research that identifies ways of reducing risk, injury, and death.
Just regarding banning assault weapons, it drives me crazy when I see in the media mention that, oh, the assault weapons ban did not reduce gun violence. Well, it didn't cure cancer either. Assault weapons account for a very small part of gun deaths. So, banning assault weapons was never going to do much for all of gun violence. It was only going to affect gun violence committed with assault weapons. So why does the media have to be so idiotic?
That wasn't directed at anybody who's current.
The next question is from Mitchell Warner. He'd like to read his own question. Is still here and would like to do that? Okay, I will read it. Reforms being proposed now are nice, but one of our chief problems is that there are over 300 million guns in America. That number has to be brought down. What is the long-term expansive, not reformist plan to take on gun violence?
Well, I agree with you that there's too many guns. There's clearly more guns per capita than any other industrialized country. But I think the things what we are suggesting that we could do that are doable with a lot of heavy lifting will statistically start to save, they'll save lives. And they've been proven to save lives. So in politics, you've got to work with people and you've got to start with the expectation of high aspirations, but get the things you can do and do it based on evidence-based research. And if I'm wrong, I should consider the research. So we can do those things if we implement on a federal level what California has done on a state level, and it will help California. And we can do what other countries have done and learn from them that statistically have dropped down the number of gun deaths, gun suicides, gun homicides, and injuries.
Next question is from Sandy. If the president won't take decisive action regarding gun control, how can we mobilize to force the issue?
You have to mobilize. You have to come to these. You have to engage. You have to do what the young people are doing. You should be part of the march on March 24th that the young people are leading. Most big transformative things in this country has not happened because of the President of the United States or the Congress. Because the people forced the issue. You look at the civil rights movement, most of us, I see a lot of people are old enough to remember that. Dr. King he had trouble with both Democratic and Republican presidents, we now know. So why did it change? It's because they marched, they sat in, they were aggressive. Same thing will happen on this issue. If these young people lead us, these laws will be enacted.
Next question is from Margaret. Could you please explain the difference, if any, between universal background checks and comprehensive background checks?
The evidence-based research is the answer to that question is semantics. They're the same thing.
The next question is from Johanna Welty. She'd like to read her own question. Are you still in the audience and like to do that? Okay, I will read it. What is your office doing to propose and/or support laws that will ensure that government officials, elected and other, take seriously credible complaints from citizens who report gun ownership by violent individuals already with criminal records?
I mentioned this in some of my comments at the beginning. If you have ideas how we can improve that, I do think there are good best practices, as I mentioned, on risk assessment. Working with schools, working with the mental health department, working with police departments. We know in this county, we know in Los Angeles, we know in other places, the things that happened in Florida most likely wouldn't have happened here because there would have been a connection. And what happened with the FBI and the local sheriff's department should not have happened. And that, I think everybody agrees on that. So if you've got ideas or you've got complaints, let us know. You'll help us win the award that we're a finalist for.
Next question is from Jen. As a 20-year-old veteran public school teacher, I am very concerned about the current discussion of arming teachers. What can we do to make sure guns stay out of the classroom and to make sure that zero federal dollars are spent on such a proposal?
Well, we'll have this discussion in the coming weeks. Again, we will rely on the experts, the people who, as was just stated, their evidence is driven by how do you avoid these things. It's not one side or the other. You may suggest that different people have their own prejudice, even in research, but we strive not to do that. So we'll listen to that, we'll do those things, and we'll have this discussion.
The idea that a good guy with a gun is going to stop a bad guy with a gun, it does happen. There are cases where defensive uses of firearms prevent injury and prevent death. The thing is that when you add up the number of injuries and deaths prevented, and then subtract all the accidental deaths or the homicides or the suicides from having more guns around, then the net effect is generally negative. And there's studies. There's a study that came out looking at as states move to make it easier to have a concealed carry permit. You see increases in violence relative to what you would have expected had they not made that move. And I think that's relevant here.
Yeah, and just in conclusion, I think it's a bad idea to arm teachers. In this county, we do a really good job, both the police departments, the sheriff's department, the county probation department, and we've done a good job in the state of California is funding this, and at the federal level, is to have specifically trained school resource officers. There was one in Florida. Unfortunately, he was just one, and he didn't have an assault weapon, and he didn't do what he was trained to do. But in this county, we have really robust system. Most of the high schools and some of the middle schools, I believe, have resource officers who are armed, and then we were trying to, when I was on the board, get juvenile probation officers in there as well. So there are grants at the federal and state level, and then you have professionally trained people who, in the case of the law enforcement officer, is armed and is on the campus and has relationships, and that's the purpose of that program.
One more thing about use of guns in self-defense more generally. There was a researcher in Florida named Gary Kleck who did some bogus research on use of guns in self-defense and found that guns are used every year 1.2 million times in self-defense. And a researcher at Harvard School of Public Health named David Hemingway looked very carefully at that research and all the errors and methodological problems in the research and published his assessment of it. And it's very, very interesting. You can find that on the web. But this idea of guns are used in self-defense 1.2 million times has, for now, it's been decades, that has been circulated around among the gun enthusiasts, and despite the many, many errors in his research, it's very interesting to see that happen.
So we have time for a couple more questions. As a reminder, any questions that were not answered today, we will answer them via mail or email, preferably email, as we try to be as environmentally friendly as possible. We are unable to respond if the card itself does not have the contact information for us to be able to respond on. Additionally, if you'd like to rewatch the town hall, it's available on the Congressman's Facebook page, as well as Comcast Channel 27, AT&T Uverse Channel 99, and ContraCostaTV.org. With that, I'll go to our next question from Gary. What is the definition of an assault weapon? Many of California's laws focus on elements that are inconsequential with regard to mass shootings, such as magazine capacity and reload speed are the most important aspects in this regard.
The term assault weapon is a very nebulous term. The original ban focused on a firearm had to have two elements of a military-style weapon. It could be a pistol grip and be semi-automatic, or have a folding stock. And so this actually makes it really difficult. So what they did was ban certain models. The focus in California on high-capacity magazines is sort of analogous, but a little bit more specific.
And our last question will be from Kitty. Is there complete disclosure with where the money comes from that is funneled to the NRA? Is there complete disclosure to how much money the NRA spends in influencing elections?
No. And I recommend this book all the time, Dark Money. It's a wonderful book about the problems of independent expenditures and tracking money and the influence of money in policy. I recommend you read it. So that's part of our problem. Let me just thank you all. Thank you for taking hours out of your day on a Saturday to come out here. I want to thank my two panelists and my staff. And lastly, the only way we change things is to have a civil debate, including people we disagree with, so I'll talk to you after. You don't have to run against me, but if you want to, that's the way it works. But the way we change things is to be engaged. Don't think that you can't make a difference. Margaret Mead famously said, never believe that one person or a small group of people can change the world. In fact, she said, that's the only thing that does. Thank you.
It's amazing what you're doing. Thanks for having a high threshold for pain.
I'm a masochist.
Oh, okay. So I'll follow up so we can get together.
Okay, I just talked to Don a couple
Oh, that's great. I love Uncle Don. He's helping us out on working. Still. Yeah. Never a dull moment.
Thank you every time I come across the bakery.